When people imagine Africa before colonization, they often imagine stillness, places untouched by movement, communities turned inward. That picture doesn't survive contact with history. Long before modern borders, goods moved across Africa in steady, deliberate flows. Gold, salt, textiles, knowledge, and people traveled routes that were known, maintained, and relied upon. These journeys were not rare events. They were part of everyday economic life. Trade connected deserts to coasts, forests to savannas, inland communities to distant markets they would never see, but deeply depended on. Movement shaped power. Movement shaped cities. Movement shaped relationships between societies that understood one another not through conquest, but through exchange. This episode follows that movement, not as a list of routes or commodities, but as a system, one that linked Africa to the wider world centuries before colonization restructured those connections. To understand this world, we have to follow what moved through it.
Trade, in this context, did not mean occasional exchange or simple barter between isolated communities. It referred to organized systems built on trust, predictability, and long memory developed over time. Merchants were not wandering opportunists, they were specialists. They understood routes, seasons, risks, prices, and obligations. Their work depended on reputation. A merchant who broke agreements did not simply lose one deal, they lost access to entire networks built carefully over years. Trade required rules. Contracts were often spoken rather than written, but they were enforced by custom, community pressure, and long-standing relationships. Safe passage depended on honoring those rules. Markets functioned because people expected fairness, consistency, accountability, and mutual respect. Scale mattered. These networks did not exist for a single journey or a single year. They were designed to last across generations. Knowledge of routes, partners, currencies, and procedures was passed down deliberately. Continuity was a feature, not an accident. Trade also shaped power. Control of routes brought influence. Access to goods brought leverage. Merchants were decision-makers, not background figures. They negotiated with leaders, advised rulers, settled disputes, and helped determine where cities formed, expanded, and prospered. Most importantly, trade created connection without conquest. Societies learned about one another through repeated exchange. Trust was built slowly, tested repeatedly, and reinforced through mutual dependence rather than domination. Understanding trade this way changes how we understand the world it supported. These were not fragile links. They were durable systems capable of supporting cities, states, and long-distance relationships over centuries across regions. Across the Sahara, trade linked West Africa to North Africa and the Mediterranean world long before modern states existed. Gold moved north, salt moved south, but trade was never just about commodities. It moved knowledge, belief, and political influence along with goods that communities depended upon. Caravans did not wander aimlessly across the desert. Routes were known, mapped through experience, and guarded by agreements with communities along the way. Travelers planned departures around seasons, water sources, and safety. Entire towns rose and fell based on caravan schedules. West African producers mined gold and controlled its flow. North African merchants provided salt, textiles, and access to wider markets. Neither side functioned as a passive supplier. Exchange depended on negotiation, trust, and mutual advantage sustained over time. Markets became centers of decision-making. Prices reflected distance, risk, and demand. Disputes were mediated through custom and reputation. A merchant's word carried weight because breaking it meant exclusion from future exchange.
These routes connected inland societies to economies far beyond the desert. Gold from West Africa entered Mediterranean and Middle Eastern markets, shaping currencies and political power elsewhere. Yet the system remained anchored locally. Control of production, transport, and access rested with African communities who understood the terrain, managed security, and enforced rules. The Sahara was not a barrier, it was a corridor. And for centuries, Trans-Saharan trade made West Africa an essential part of a connected world. That continuity allowed wealth, information, and authority to circulate reliably, reinforcing institutions, sustaining livelihoods, and integrating distant regions into shared economic rhythms generation after generation. Without centralized empires directing it. Trade also shaped power. Control of routes brought influence. Access to goods brought leverage. Merchants were decision-makers, not background figures. They negotiated with leaders, advised rulers, settled disputes, and helped determine where cities formed, expanded, and prospered. Most importantly, trade created connection without conquest. Societies learned about one another through repeated exchange. Trust was built slowly, tested repeatedly, and reinforced through mutual dependence rather than domination. Understanding trade this way changes how we understand the world it supported. These were not fragile links. They were durable systems capable of supporting cities, states, and long-distance relationships over centuries across regions.
In East Africa, trade unfolded across the Indian Ocean, linking the continent to Arabia, Persia, India, and Southeast Asia. These connections were not sudden arrivals. They developed over centuries through repeated voyages, seasonal rhythms, and shared expectations between merchants who learned when to sail, when to wait, and whom to trust. Coastal cities emerged where ships returned reliably. Harbors became meeting points for languages, beliefs, and goods. African merchants exported gold, ivory, timber, and agricultural products. In return, they received textiles, ceramics, metals, and new ideas that circulated inland. Navigation depended on knowledge of winds and currents. Sailors timed journeys to monsoon cycles, allowing predictable movement across long distances. This predictability reduced risk and made large-scale exchange possible without constant conflict. Trade here was partnership, not extraction. African merchants owned ships, negotiated prices, and controlled access to inland markets. Foreign traders operated within local rules, customs, and authority structures. Urban life reflected this exchange. Stone buildings, marketplaces, and mosques signaled permanence rather than temporary camps. Wealth generated through trade supported learning, craftsmanship, and governance along the coast. These networks tied East Africa into a wider world while remaining rooted locally. Coastal societies balanced external connection with internal stability. Indian Ocean trade did not replace African systems. It moved through them, reinforcing existing structures and extending their reach across water rather than desert. For centuries, these routes sustained prosperity, cultural exchange, and political influence, linking Africa eastward into global systems long before later disruptions altered those relationships. They demonstrate continuity, resilience, and intentional integration within networks spanning oceans, cultures, economies, and generations over long time.
Rivers shaped trade inside Africa as much as deserts and oceans shaped connections beyond it. The Niger, Nile, and Congo functioned as highways. They carried people, crops, tools, and news across long distances, linking inland communities to markets, rulers, and one another. Seasonal flooding renewed farmland and synchronized travel, creating predictable rhythms for exchange. River transport reduced cost and risk. Canoes moved heavier loads than caravans could, and travel followed familiar channels marked by settlements and stopping points. Knowledge of currents, banks, and portages passed between generations, turning geography into infrastructure. Markets formed where rivers met paths. Towns grew at crossings and bends, collecting tolls, storing goods, and resolving disputes. Authority followed access. Leaders protected routes, mediated conflicts, and maintained rules that kept movement steady. Rivers also connected diverse ecologies. Forest products reached savannas, grain moved downstream, fish and salt traveled inland. Exchange encouraged specialization, while mutual dependence discouraged isolation. These networks were not improvised. They relied on trust, schedules, and shared expectations. Agreements governed passage, prices, and obligations, enforced by reputation and community sanction rather than constant force. Seen this way, Africa's interior was not remote, it was integrated. River systems stitched regions together, supporting cities, governance, and long-distance trade that endured for centuries. Movement along water sustained livelihoods, spread ideas, and anchored economies to landscapes people understood intimately. Through rivers, communities coordinated labor, managed surplus, and planned futures, proving connectivity inside the continent was deliberate, resilient, and essential to everyday life across generations and regions for centuries, continuously.
By now, one thing should be clear. Trade did more than move goods. It shaped where people lived. Routes became meeting points. Meeting points became markets. Markets became cities. Wealth accumulated. Knowledge settled. Authority followed permanence. To understand what these networks produced, we have to stop following movement and start examining place. Because the next part of this story is not about roads, rivers, or oceans. It's about cities. That's where we go next.